Hi, everyone. Welcome to the COVID-19 X Politics Seminar. Thank you all for joining us today. So before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple of Zoom things. So while you're not talking, please just stay on mute so that there's no background noise. But if you have any questions or comments, just put them in the chat and we'll make sure to call on you during the Q&A portion of the seminar. Also, if you're able to, we encourage you to keep your video on. This seminar is being recorded. However, the video that will be shared won't show your video or any identifying information. So I'll start by introducing myself, and feel free to also introduce yourself in the chat. You can put your name, pronouns, school, and where you're joining us from. So I'm Maya. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Pittsburgh, and I'm going to be a senior next year at Alderdice High School. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all today because I believe that our political institutions play an important role in building back better and that it's important for us as youth to engage in this process.
Hi, my name is Jeremiah Davis. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a recent graduate of City Charter High School, and I'm interested in politics because I believe that politics is the way that you can make the world a better place through sound leadership. So I'm very happy today that we're joined by our two guests, Mr. Delano and Sarah Immorado. Maya, would you introduce Sarah?
Yes. So to begin, we'll hear brief introductory remarks by Pennsylvania Representative Sarah Immorado, a proud Lawrenceville resident who ran for office, guided by a mission, leveling the playing field to ensure that all Pennsylvanians have equal access to opportunities to lead a life with dignity. Growing up in Ross Township, she graduated from North Hills High School and worked her way through college from the University of Pittsburgh with a degree in business. Sarah co-founded an initiative called She Runs SWPA, which aims to empower more women to run for elected office in the region. Soon after, she sought to join them and bring new leadership to the Commonwealth, winning her own race in 2018. As a legislator, Sarah's initiatives always seek to put people first and center the most vulnerable. She is currently a member of the House Health, Transportation, and Urban Affairs Committees and champions improved and expanded Medicare for All, a fair tax system, economic dignity through fair pay in a union, affordable housing, clean air and water, and well-funded public education. During the current COVID-19 crisis, Sarah continues to push for legislation that assists those now facing economic hardship and food and housing insecurity. So if you have any questions for her at any point throughout the seminar, feel free to add those to the chat and we'll call on you during the Q&A portion. Thank you so much for joining us, Representative Immorado. I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry I had to sit through that long introduction. And I just want to say to what Jeremiah was saying is like, yes, 100%, 100 times, like government is a force for good, or it should be a force for good, right? It depends on who we democratically elect and put there. So we need to make sure that we are paying attention to who is in these seats, because government is a reflection of ourselves and our values. And if we don't see that reflected in our governing bodies, then it's up to us to do something about it. So my name is Sarah Immorado. I am a state representative here in Pennsylvania. I live in Pittsburgh, so I do travel back and forth to our state capital, Harrisburg. I'll be real with you all. I didn't think that I would ever hold public office. You probably all in high school are much more politically aware than I was. I came to politics by way of lived experience. Growing up, I lived in the suburbs, had a really stable life. And then when I was a teenager, we found out my father had an opioid addiction. And my mom left him with me and my sister, and she had a high school education, and I watched her struggle to find a job, an hourly job that paid her a wage where she could support two teenage daughters. I was the first person in my family to go to college, so I struggled with paying for applications, knowing what to write on the applications. And then I found myself inside of the financial aid office often during my 4 years at Pitt, because I just, was trying to make the numbers add up, and cleaning, cleaning locker rooms and babysitting and working in restaurants, just trying to kind of like pay tuition every semester. And then when I graduated, it was 2008, which is very much kind of like a very similar economy to what we have now. And I felt like I had done the work. I had, quote unquote, pulled myself up by the bootstraps, and still I had this mountain of debt and I couldn't find a job anywhere. And so I found myself doing the same hourly wage work that I watched my mom and her sisters, my aunts do, and most of my cousins. And that was like kind of where I felt like, is the American dream, does it still exist? And if so, who does it exist for? And that question was kind of always in the back of my mind. And I did end up going into nonprofit work, which was lovely. And I said, this is the sector. This is how we change the world, through nonprofit work. And I watched really smart, engaged people work really, really hard to try to solve the world's greatest problems, like poverty, like blight, like housing insecurity, like food insecurity, like education, like cleaning our air and water. And I saw that their potential was capped by bad policy and apathetic leadership. And I didn't think I would be the person to run, but when you have folks who start questioning, like, who should be the person to run for office, you look for typically we look for people with accolades, and we really should be looking to the people who are closest to the issues and closest to the problem and closest to the pain. And through that, the thing that I cherish most in my pursuit of office is my lived experience. And I think that really informs and humanizes the way, not only the way that I govern and the policies that I prioritize. And just like I never expected to be in elected office, I never expected to be governing during a global pandemic and a global recession. But yet that's where I found myself since March of this year. And I would have to say that things have changed, but what this global crisis has done is really lay bare the injustices and the inequities that have long existed before COVID-19. So we're talking about people who are underemployed and don't make a living wage. We're talking about people who didn't have access to affordable health care. We're talking about the disparities in education and how some school districts, turned on a dime and were able to get students laptops, and other kids just missed 3 months of school because the school didn't have the resources to be able to deliver quality education and adapt to the changing times. We see it in housing, in our eviction crisis that's pending. So the precarity that a lot of people were living on, a lot of Americans who were told the story of the American dream, are now teetering on the edge, and COVID-19 was the thing that kind of pushed them over. So there's so many people who are aware of the structural inefficiencies and the structural injustices that have existed for a very long time, and that a lot of our communities, especially our Black and Brown communities, have been experienced for quite some time. So as we think through human-centered solutions to this ginormous problem, I think that our greatest strength is our solidarity and our empathy with one another, and that we need leaders who are going to listen more than they talk at times, and make sure that folks are coming together to share their voices, to share their lived experience, and to share their ideas on how we actually build a stronger and more resilient future. So I look forward to our conversations today. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Thank you, Representative Immorado. Very deep, and I know why you are elected to our lovely state house. Having leaders like yourself who are committed to compassionate governance is so important, and it very warms my heart that you are fighting the good fight for the people of Pennsylvania. I would like to introduce Mr. Delano. John Delano has been a political analyst for KDKA CBS since 1994, and as one of Pennsylvania's most respected commentators, John is recognized for his ability to analyze complex issues and make them understandable to any audience. Having worked in both government and private business world, practiced law, and reported on radio and television, and written extensively and taught in graduate level school, John combined experience allowing him to speak with some authority about government, political, and economic issues. John has reported both the 2016 Republican and Democratic presidential conventions with over 25 years of 25 on-air appearances. And over the years, John has interviewed a number of national political figures, including President Trump, Joe Biden, and former President Barack Obama. Mr. Delano, we're turning over for you for some remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremiah, and Representative Immorado, and all the rest of you who are here today. It's a delight to be with you. I'm the old guy here. He, him, is that it? He, him, his, those are my pronouns. And I'm very happy to be part of this program. I said earlier to a couple of the moderators that I am a big fan of the World Affairs Council, because I think so many of us have very insular way of looking at things. We're so tied up in our neighborhoods or our local communities, and yet we are part of a much larger world community. And I commend each of you for the work that you do and will do over the years to come. I'm at the end of my career. Most of you, well, all of you, and as Ms. Immorado as well, are at the beginning of your career. I've had the great pleasure as the Money and Politics editor for KDK Television of interviewing a number of our national leaders. Jeremiah mentioned I interviewed President Barack Obama 8 times over the course of his presidency and campaigning for the presidency. And at the same time, I interviewed those who ran against him, Mitt Romney or John McCain, or their running mates like Sarah Palin or House Speaker Paul Ryan. In this campaign, obviously, it's Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. I did a one-on-one interview with President Trump last fall and a one-on-one interview with Vice President Biden this spring. And I had that opportunity. Well, number one, I'm aggressive in going out to get interviews, but it's really because of how important this state and this region is in politics. There's a reason why candidates running for national office, and I dare say running for statewide office, care about Western Pennsylvania. In part, it's because we vote and we participate. We have good leaders like Sarah and others who are out there. And we also, I think, have an opportunity to influence outcomes as a result of political outcomes, as a result of who we are and how we participate and engage. And so I know that when Barack Obama wants an interview with me as a senator from Illinois, it's because he's thinking of running for president down the line, and it's an opportunity to meet an important region of this Commonwealth that will ultimately determine who wins or who loses elections. And the same, of course, for Donald Trump or Joe Biden or any of the others. So it's because of you, it's because of your parents and grandparents and all those who participate in politics that people like me get the opportunity to sit down and actually talk to folks like the candidates. And this, of course, is on the state level as well, the governors and senators and all those guys, members of Congress. So what do I do? You know, well, my job, there's really kind of a couple different hats. One of my jobs, it seems to me, is to help people hear the politicians that we have and understand what it is they're trying to say. and it's a journalist's role. It's a reporting role. And I try to do it in a very fair and balanced way, which is to say, if I have someone on one side, I want to try to find someone on the other side. Now, many issues are not divided that way. And you have to be careful of so-called false equivalencies, where you equate one group with another group just because you're trying to get alternative views. And there's a lot of challenge that journalists have doing this. And it's become even more so challenging during the era of social media, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and all the blowback you get every time I do a story. It doesn't matter. I interviewed Barack Obama and I was called the N-word. And you have no idea the abuse you take anytime you interview a certain candidate. I interview Donald Trump and I get the same kind of blowback from the other side. And so it just kind of goes with the territory when you are trying to be fair to all. That's one side of what I do, and most of what I do is that journalistic side. But I also believe that as a political analyst, I have an interpretive side, which is to try to explain why some of these political leaders do the crazy things they do, and to bring to bear the fact that before I became a journalist 25 years ago, I was chief of staff to a Pennsylvania congressman in Washington, D.C. for 14 years. Now, this was long before any of you were born. It was in the Reagan-Bush years, and when Bush was president, the first Bush was president. I was young, and it was a great opportunity to see politics up close and personal, and to see it from Sarah Innamorado's side, from the elected official side. And so I can bring some of that to bear. I'm a lawyer by background. I was trained as a lawyer. I practiced as a lawyer. I was a trial attorney, but I didn't really enjoy that. I enjoyed this a whole lot more. And it's been, for me, it's been a great experience and a great career. As I say, I'm probably in the twilight of it. I have enjoyed teaching for 25 years at Carnegie Mellon University at the Heinz College, teaching students public policy. And many of my students go on to become elected officials or to be cabinet members in Governor Wolf or Governor Corbett's administration. And it's always kind of neat to see the success of some of the students that you knew when they were quite young. But for me, I think, I hope I'll certainly answer any questions that you have, that even though this is being recorded, and I could say to you, it's off the record. Probably the first rule that I teach politicians is that nothing really is ever off the record. No matter how much you trust a journalist, anything you say could be used against you at some point. So I won't say we're off the record, but I'll certainly answer any questions you have. And I know part of this is to talk about how challenging our jobs are during this pandemic, which clearly it is. One other thing I want to say, and that is that I do a lot of work with through the State Department and the, I guess it's called Global Pittsburgh. It used to be the Pittsburgh Council for International Visitors. It's an organization through the State Department where I have the opportunity to meet journalists and politicians from around the world. I just did a podcast with Russian journalists Monday. And I think, again, I can't say enough to each of you for your willingness to be part of the World Affairs Council. It's a great group, a great organization, and the opportunity to help reach out to others and to help people in our area understand the importance of our role in the world is really, really important. So thank you. Thank you for being part of and letting me be part of all this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Mr. Delano. I'm excited to hear more about your perspective on how the pandemic is affecting the upcoming elections. But before we get to that, we're going to do just a quick icebreaker. If you were here last week, it's kind of similar to the one we did in the last seminar. Great. Okay. So thank you all for participating in that. And we're going to get started with our Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Jeremiah.
Okay, we're going to continue this conversation with Ms. Immorado and Mr. Delano. And we would like to just thank you all for coming in and joining us. And if you have a question, you can add the question to the chat, and we'll ask you to ask the question to our panelists. And if you're not, that's comfortable, that's fine. Just let us know in the chat. And to get things started, I want to ask a question to both of you. Mr. Delano, you kind of touched on this in your introduction, but how has COVID-19 has impacted the way that you do your jobs, that you do your day jobs? Any one of you can start the question.
Sarah, do you want me to go? I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy to start. It's made my job very difficult on some levels. Everything we do, I've been working from home. You're looking at my home attic. As you can see, I'm up here. It's kind of a little bit of a man cave, and it's a mess. My wife hates the fact that every night this room is on television, but I'm doing everything from this room. And the truth is that all my interviews for the last 18 weeks have been conducted via Zoom. So I interview politicians and business leaders. As the money and politics guy, I cover business and economic development, along with the political and governmental stories. Just a short time ago, I interviewed Patrick Murray, who heads the Monmouth University Institute of Politics, because the Monmouth poll is just out today showing Joe Biden defeating Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. And my story tonight will be on that, but I have to write it and interview and do everything from up here in my little home office. So it has very much affected, I think, the ability to be out and about. I do a lot of moderating of programs and public speaking. Very little of that. We've done some of it via Zoom, but all of that is shut down because people aren't gathering together. But I think from a reporting standpoint, nobody is allowed into our TV station. You may have noticed every reporter is either working from home or they're out on the street with a photographer, but they're not allowed in. The only people allowed in is like one anchor and one weather person and a producer. We're not gathering together yet. And given what's happening across the country and even here in Pennsylvania in terms of resurgence, I don't think it's likely we're going to be back anytime soon. So, Sarah, I'll defer to you. You've got it. I mean, the state house and state senate, they've got wacky ways they have to operate now, right?
Yeah. So from a, I guess, Harrisburg perspective, in March, we passed some regulations that allowed us to vote remotely. So we have been caucusing and voting remotely, which is, the Senate has a little bit more technology than the House. There's 203 members of the House. So some people physically still have to go there, and we have to tell, it's like a phone tree where I have to tell one of the reps who's up there how I want to vote, and they have to physically go push my button. So it's a little bit old school, but it's hard. And I mean, John can probably understand this, is that like a lot of like understanding what's going on in the trading that's happening and what policies are going to run, and you know, who's trading what for what. A lot of that you get by being present, physically present in the state capitol, and like talking to people and like listening to what's going on. There's so many things that are like kind of unofficial on how you gather information. So you're kind of absent from that. So it feels like, it feels very much like you're playing catch up, which is why I went up there the last couple times, because we saw some anti-environment bills that I needed to speak on, because I knew very few of my colleagues would go speak on it. So, you know, and you look around the House floor, there's still people who aren't wearing masks because they don't believe that, or for whatever reason, I don't want to say why they're not wearing masks, but they're not, and that's observable. So it's been interesting. And then back at home, you know, we have a small office on Butler Street in Lawrenceville, and so it's been very much like, how do we keep our team safe, and how do I let them like kind of guide what they feel comfortable doing and how they feel comfortable helping the community. So a lot of our stuff has shifted to virtual town halls, virtual meetings, over the phone casework. We've seen so much unemployment compensation issues, people scared about not being able to pay rent and facing eviction, folks not having, worried about the amount of food that they have in their home, parents who are worried about making sure that their kids get a proper education, you know, students who are like, you know, they're trying to figure out what they're going to do in the fall, whether it's they're going to school or whether they're going or university, or whether they're going to back to high school, and like what that means for them, for their safety and for their education and for their future. And so there's so many unknowns, and so we're just trying to be available while also keeping ourselves safe. So you know, our office is locked. If we have to meet with someone, we will meet with them outside. I do a lot of video calls and things like this. In a lot of ways, it's actually made me, I think, a little bit more accessible, because you can stack up a lot of different, you know, I probably wouldn't be able to be in a physical space with you today, given my schedule, but I can, you know, I can be here virtually, and we can have a cool dialogue. So
If I could tag along on that, I think Sarah is 100% correct, that I know that it's easier for me to get interviews in some ways because people are stuck in their homes. And so for me, the challenge is just being able to to locate them. But I think that's absolutely true. I think, for example, me doing this at this hour on a day when I'm at the station would have been absolutely impossible. It would not have happened. I could never have said yes to it. And so I think the pandemic, I mean, if there's a blessing, and there's very few blessings out of this thing as far as I'm concerned, I guess if there's one of them, it has allowed for more of this kind of contact than we ever had before.
Ben, would you like to ask your questions?
Sure. I guess I'll ask my first question to Sarah. So we've seen a lot of problems and corruption with the PPP and where the benefits are going, usually going to the top in big businesses rather than in small businesses where they were intended to go. And what does this say about a larger issue, and how do we get the tax money going in the right spot?
yeah. So you're doing the first part, which is follow the money, right? So you're following the money from the federal government to our local businesses and nonprofits as well. And you also have to watch where else money flows. So where does, in the form of campaign contributions. So I always say, like, a lot of the issues that we advocate for and that we care about, you kind of have to look at where do elected politicians get their campaign dollars, and whose interests are they representing. So I think, you know, with any sort of government program, it's really looking critically of where people get money and where they get their support from. And, you know, as like, this is a challenge in government at the federal and state level. It's like, you want to make sure that, like, businesses need help, and we need to make sure that that money gets there and that there's some level of accountability built in. But if you look at the way that we're distributing PPP money to these fairly large, like Wall Street based companies, and then you look at how we distribute food stamps and the amount of bureaucracy and checks and balances and things like that that are built in just to get people a few $100s a month, like, that differential is like super stark. So we have to look at, like, I think it just is, illustrates how we have to rethink our systems and who they serve, because they aren't serving people, they aren't serving our small Main Street businesses, they aren't serving people in need, they aren't serving folks who are experiencing unemployment and who are in crisis. So I think it just speaks to a broader issue of kind of our upside down priorities in government.
And if I could chime in, the PPP program, which is the Payroll Protection Program, it was really designed by the federal government. Sarah had nothing to do with the way this thing was designed. It was designed by Congress in Washington. And it basically was a huge sum of money, billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, that was allocated through banks. It was basically money given to banks who would then award it to their favorite customers, their favorite clients. And what we saw happening, particularly in the early days of the PPP program, Ben, was that people were getting the money who were big corporations because they had the banking relationships with the PNCs and the Citizens Bank and all the big banks. So in many ways, the program was not, I mean, there are lots of ways you could design the allocation of federal monies that might have prevented that. But that's not what this Congress did, in part because, you know, nothing happens in Washington right now without Republicans and Democrats coming together. And so there's a lot of compromise, and some of that compromise is not compromise for the good. I just wanted to throw that thought out there.
And it did actually inform the way that we designed our Main Street grant program at the state. So the state got some federal money that they were allowed to design a program around. And so we thought that we can't distribute these monies through commercial banks because there was also a lot of skimming off the top of the PPP program, so to speak. And so we decided to distribute it through CDFIs, which are community development financial institutions, which are nonprofits. They're rooted in community. They typically, the relationships that they have are with, I would say, like mission-driven small businesses. So we took that into consideration when we were figuring out how we were going to distribute funds. And also we looked at it through the lens of equity. So nearly half of the money that's being distributed must go to women or minority owned businesses.
Thank you, Representative Immorado and Mr. Delano, for reaching on those points that we talked about in the introduction about good governance and compassionate governance, and as it relates to the PPE program. I want to turn it over to talk more broadly about the election. How has COVID-19 impacted lawmakers' priorities, and how has it impacted our presidential candidates' methods for campaigning and their methods to the campaigns? To Mr. Delano, I would like to hear your thoughts about it after Mr. Delano speaks, Representative Immorado. Thank you.
Well, there's no question that it has dramatically impacted the way the candidates campaign. I mean, Sarah is up for re-election as well, although she didn't have an opponent in the primary. I'm not sure. Do you have an opponent in the fall? I think you do, don't you? Yeah. So you obviously, almost everybody, there are a number of incumbents in the state house that do not get challenged ever. It's not a good thing in my view. I think it's always good to have a challenge. But what you're seeing happen from a political standpoint, and let's go to the macro, the presidential election. I interviewed Joe Biden from my attic while he was in his basement. Now, it was a very good interview. We had time to chit chat before we started recording, and I've interviewed him in the past, so I don't know whether he really knows me. I never know whether they remember you. They always act like they do, but some, you know, the national politicians meet so many journalists over the years, so who knows. But in any case, that interview was very different because normally I would be in the room. When I interviewed President Trump at the convention center, he was here for an appearance before the Marcellus Shale Coalition. And I had worked really hard to get a one-on-one with him. He's not done one-on-ones with any with any Western Pennsylvania TV reporter. So it was hard to get that interview. And even up to the last minute, they kept telling me, you know, he can nix this at any time. He can veto this and he may not show up. Well, he did show up. And but it was in one of these rooms that they set aside, and they put the American flags, and I mean, and of course there's a gazillion Secret Service and the rest around you. But the bottom line is you're actually shaking hands and you're chit-chatting with the president, talking to him, and that helps, I think, for you to get a feel for who that politician is. You can't do that during this pandemic, or it's harder. You'll see some of my colleagues are interviewing people for their stories using a hockey stick and attaching a microphone at the end so that they are at least 6 feet away. I mean, that's not the way I want to interview political people or candidates. So the interviews that I've been doing, and I've been interviewing a number of congressmen and challengers to them, state senators and challengers, and I did a couple of the state house races that were close and thought to be interesting in the spring. But all of those interviews were done via Zoom. And so from a journalist standpoint, it just makes it a bit more challenging. I'll let Sarah talk about the politics of how do you campaign? How do you go door to door when nobody wants you at their door? You know, do you bother them on the telephone? I mean, there's a limit to how many phone calls people want. And so I think it's a real challenge for the candidates. But Sarah, you're the expert on that. How do you do it?
Yeah, and I think like it's important to tell folks that like when you have when you are in elected office and you're running as an incumbent, you have a legislative office and you do outreach through that, and you do education, and you connect people to services, and you act generally as a helper. But all of that needs to stay completely separate from campaigning. So that all needs to be done on your personal time. And you can't use any of your legislative resources to do that. So not only do you have this full-time job of, you know, serving the people and listening to folks and making sure that they're getting help in a time of crisis, but then you also have to do this campaign piece. And you know, so I think that really in the primary, we didn't have a competitive primary. So we really wanted to take the time to check in with people. And so we used text messaging services and phone calls and emails to say, hi, how are you? Do you need help? Can we connect you with any resources? And so we switched our campaign to more of like a buddy system and just neighbors helping neighbors. Folks didn't, elections and politics were not top of mind, but making sure your family fed was, and making sure that your neighbors were taken care of and that your community was thriving was. And so we wanted to, like, so many people got involved in our campaign for the first time because they also wanted to express an act of service. And so we created that space for them. So that's really what our primary campaign looked like. We also had to do a lot of education because for the first time ever, Pennsylvania has allowed mail-in voting. That was a law that was passed in 2019, and actually just in the nick of time because it allowed us to be more adaptable in the election this year, given the COVID-19 crisis. And so as we're moving forward to the general, a lot of it has to do with remote education. So we're doing this, like we're using the same kind of tactics to reach people, whether that's virtual town halls or text messaging, phone calls, and really first just not going right to who are you voting for, but like, how are you and do you have what you need? Because we have an infrastructure and so we can help connect people to the services and the people who can help them if they're not. And then, you know, secondarily, we can say like, you know, this is democracy. Democracy is, it doesn't take a break, even when there is a global pandemic. So how do we make sure that your voice is heard and that you get to exercise your constitutional rights? So we make sure that people are educated in how to request a mail-in ballot, what it looks like to submit it. If they are like really gung-ho about voting in person, how do they do it safely? So that's really kind of how our campaign has shifted. And you know, we have been able to do things virtually. So we've been reaching people who maybe would have never showed up for a town hall because they have young kids and there's often not childcare, or you know, they're homebound, or they don't have a bus that runs in the evening. And so we're able, I think, to sometimes be creative and reach people who maybe have not been engaged before.
Thank you. So you mentioned mail-in voting. So can you both talk a little bit more about that, how the most recent primary elections went, like what we can learn from that, and how to ensure that the upcoming elections will be safe and fair?
Yeah, I did a number of stories on the mail-in ballot process and the snafus that occurred afterwards. The fact that it took some counties, including Philadelphia, weeks to count the ballots, which raises all kinds of red flags for this November's election, because people are used to having results on election night or in the early morning. And if for some reason the presidency of the United States depends on Pennsylvania's results, and Philadelphia is not counting the votes like they should quickly, can you imagine what Donald Trump is going to say about Philadelphia and the Democrats and Pennsylvania stealing an election? Because those votes are overwhelmingly for the Democrats. So, I mean, there's so much at stake in how we process this. But there ought not to be a debate, in my personal view, there ought not to be a debate about the value of voting by mail. I think that anything that encourages more people to participate, especially during a pandemic when a lot of folks, particularly folks my age, are afraid to go to polling places, I think is a good thing. And the fact that we now have no-fault voting in Pennsylvania, and by the way, we have no-fault voting in Pennsylvania, meaning you don't need an excuse. You used to have an excuse to vote by mail. Now anyone can vote by mail. That was approved by a Republican legislature, Republican Senate, with Democratic votes. It was a bipartisan measure. It was not somebody trying to stick it to one party or another. I think there was a common consensus of the value of this. So the process itself is not that difficult. I used it actually in this last election. And although I did a lot of stories about people who claimed that they were getting multiple ballots or they got multiple applications, a lot of the times when we investigated this stuff, it turned out to be not true, that people did not really understand the difference between an application and a ballot. And we tried to clarify that. To me, the biggest problem going forward, and I'll let the representative speak to this, but I think county elections departments, number one, we really should keep our neighborhood voting places. When you do screwy things like forcing all the people in a particular community to go to one place, or to go to, in a city council district, to go to one location, you disrupt voting patterns. And I think you really affect communities of the poor in particular. I think those who have older folks who are so used to voting at a certain place, and I don't care what their color is, although I do think there's a disparate impact on people of color when you mess around with voting locations. So I think we want to make sure that all the voting locations are open in Pennsylvania come this November. And secondly, I think it's important that county election officials be able to get a head start on counting all these mail-in ballots. Philadelphia essentially did not start counting until after the election was over, and it took them days and days and days. Allegheny County was much better, in part because we had 100 poll workers that were brought in, and they started counting the absentee ballots at 7 a.m. on election day, which under the current law is allowed. Frankly, they should be able to start earlier than that. So these are some technical things, but the bottom line is that voting by mail is a good thing. It should be encouraged. And frankly, there's a lot, I could give you a lot of other suggestions, I know Sarah could too, on how we could improve the voting process to make sure more people participate. If you truly believe we are a small d democratic society, then you have to support expanding the franchise, not restricting it, not narrowing it, which seems to be the play in a number of states. Fortunately, Pennsylvania, I think, has been working in the opposite direction to make it easier to vote, but there's still a lot more we could do here. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, we can't politicize mail-in voting. We can't politicize democracy because that is all of our constitutional rights. But it is our job as elected officials to understand how people vote and why people don't vote, and to design policies and to design the legislation and the policies that implement that legislation in a way that centers the folks who are most vulnerable to not being able to exercise their right to vote. So mail-in ballot and a lot of mail-in ballots in a lot of ways does help people who maybe don't have access to a vehicle, who are physically disabled in some way. It also gives folks an opportunity to research if they have access to the internet on the candidates, so they can make a more informed decision and they aren't just like texting their friends while they're in the voting booth on who they should vote for. And then also we need to think about who mail-in voting, if we are fully implement that, who that potentially leaves behind, which are like housing insecure people. So if you don't have a stable address and you constantly have to move, is your mail-in ballot going to get to you? No, it probably won't. So we want to make sure that, you know, as we're thinking about these things, it's not an all or nothing type scenario, but it's as many avenues as possible to increase the franchise, to increase folks actually being able to exercise their right to vote and their voice and their priorities. So I think that's kind of where we're at. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that in Allegheny County, which is like making sure we have more locations, making sure we have secure drop-off locations at multiple places in the county. If we have limited resources, then we need to make sure we have, we run that through an equity formula that goes to the communities where there's the highest rates of poverty, where there's the least access to vehicles and bus lines. So, you know, we need to think about all of those things. We can't just make decisions because they're politically expedient, or maybe like they don't, you know, they're more like just like, oh, if I put one in every municipality, some municipalities are 0.62 square miles and other municipalities are several square miles. So, you know, you can't just simplify things that easily. You have to really think about the nuance and how people get to the polls and how they vote.
Thank you, Representative Immorado. I know Mr. Delano has to leave off early, and we thank him for taking some time out of his day to speak to some students. We just want to end off this conversation asking, what can youth do to get involved in to rebuild our political systems and our country back better? The whole theme of this seminar is focused on building back better. So how can youth get involved in that process?
That's a great question and a very tough one. And by the way, I know there were some questions we may not have had time for. I just put my email in the chat. Feel free to email me a question if you have one, and I promise you I'll try to get back to you. Give me a couple days, but I will get back to you. You know, I think the fact that you're participating in this program right from the get-go as high school students shows that you care and that you have an interest. And you can't start too young, truthfully. and I think getting engaged and getting involved, when you went through those series of questions at the very beginning, and I had thumbs up for every single one of them, I think that you have to pick and choose for yourself where you think you can be most useful and where you can be most helpful. I've always been, and I participated in many protests. I marched on the streets in my younger days on a lot of different topics, from civil rights to anti-war activities back in, quote, my day. But I've also learned over the years that it's very important to participate politically. And, you don't make the change in government, in public policies, just by marching on the street. You have to elect people like Sarah in Immorado or others who represent your viewpoints. And so I'm a huge believer in political advocacy, which means getting engaged in your neighborhood and in your community on behalf of candidates who reflect the kind of change that you're looking for. And I mean, Sarah's a good example. I mean, nobody gave her a shot in hell of getting elected to the State House, but she's a very hard worker, and she went out and she beat an incumbent. And, that's not easy to do in this political process, but it can be done. And it's done with folks like you making a decision that you want to be engaged, and you pick your issues. We all have different issues, whether it goes from the environment to racial equity issues to criminal justice issues. Whatever the issue is that really moves you, engage. And then finally, and this is somewhat selfish, don't forget your friends in the media. And when I say friends, I don't mean that they're going to necessarily reflect everything that you believe or say, but the media is a way in which to communicate. And my experience is that those politicians who return my calls the fastest, who engage with me, send me material, including my own state rep, who I think does a tremendous job. And I have to be careful because I don't cover his race. I stay out of all that stuff. He's unopposed, so it's not an issue. But the real point here is that those who respond and those who engage with journalists so that you can get your story and your message out there will go a lot further. And by the way, you do that with honey, not with vinegar. Nothing angers reporters more than being yelled and screamed at and tweeted and Instagrammed and Facebooked negative comments that usually are untrue in any case. But your media can be an ally to all of this. But most importantly, I really think just choosing to get engaged and choosing to be involved in whatever the cause is that you wish on a political level. I think Sarah's a good example. You can change a whole lot of stuff in a political dimension just by engaging. And Jeremiah, thank you for acknowledging. I do have to get off the air or you won't see me on TV at 6:30. I've got to put my story together, but it has been great to be with you. jdelano@kdk.com. By all means, feel free to stay in touch. If I can ever be helpful to any one of you, feel free to email me and to indicate that we met at this webinar for the World Affairs Council. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Delano. Representative Immorado, could you comment on that question real quick, and we'll close out then.
Sure. I mean, I think when we were asking the questions of like, who has ever met with an elected representative, I saw a lot of like thumbs down. And that's like the primary job of your elected representatives, is to meet with their constituents and the people who are stakeholders in the decisions that they're making every day. Because for a lot of folks, those are life or death decisions. And so really, I just want to say that you are the expert in your lived experience. You are the person who knows what it's like to be a student and knows what it's like to navigate the world as you. And no one else does, you know, not even that elected representative. And so that experience is so important and so vital for elected officials to understand kind of intimately the issues that are impacting everyone's lives. So I just want to say, first and foremost, you are an expert in whatever story you're going to share with an elected representative, with your legislator. So have that confidence going into it. And then it's really simple. Like, you just want to pick up the phone and call the office. Those numbers are public, or send an email request and just say, I would like to meet with the representative about X topic. If you're specific, you know, that person who works in the office is going to get back to you, and they're going to say, all right, I can get 20 minutes on the calendar. And, you know, so when you have that time, it's not a whole lot of time, but like, prep for it, get your story. If you have any supporting research for a particular issue that you're advocating for, make sure you do that. All the elected representatives, especially in the state house, have YouTube channels, so you can see the floor speeches they've given. You can see what committees they're on. So, you know, try to do some research in that individual's background, so you know how to best frame the issue that you want to speak about. So, like, for example, the Black Caucus in Harrisburg, they took over the rostrum and wouldn't let the speaker get on the start session until they considered some of the criminal justice bills that have been languishing in the Judiciary Committee. Now, if you would have, and I've been getting so many emails about changing the use of force law, which I'm very supportive of. And we do have a bill in the State House. So if you're on our State House website, you can go and look up the bill number. You can see who's already on that bill. You can see the video of like the Black Legislative Caucus and the allies that took over that rostrum. And so you know that, like, coming into a conversation with me, it's going to be like, it's going to be a much easier conversation if you also support changing the use of force law. So we can kind of dive into it. You kind of have a little bit more perspective. Now, if you're talking to maybe one of my Republican colleagues and you're represented by them, and that's an issue you care about, you're going to have to frame it a little bit differently and provide some more context for why you think this is an important issue. So I think, you know, doing your research really helps. And I do want to just reiterate, like, you know, I love social media in a way to like inform constituents, but like none of the world's problems have ever been solved by a tweet. So while it's helpful to like organize, to raise awareness and engage in some, you know, sometimes constructive dialogue, for the most part, it's really going to require us to have like a one-on-one conversation or small group conversations to really move elected officials on the issues that you are passionate about and that impact your lives. So, you know, but don't be afraid to have those conversations because they're so necessary. And I know I really welcome them. And I've been able to work with young people in designing legislation. That's an opportunity that's open to all of you. So if there is an issue and a bill doesn't exist, you can write one. And how cool is that? Like, you can be a part of the legislative process so intimately, because I'll tell you what, if you aren't meeting with your elected representatives, some highly paid lobbyist is, and that's going to be the only narrative that they hear. So it's really important for us as citizens to be able to engage with the people who are in these decision-making positions, because they need to make sure that your life and the lives of your family members and friends are considered whenever they're pushing that up or down button. So just make that phone call. And then next time we talk, when we ask that question, who's met with an elected representative, everyone will have a thumbs up, which would be amazing. And we'll solve all the world's problems by then as well.
Very wise words, Representative Immorado. We are running over a little bit over time, but if you want to sign off, you can. We have our YouTube channel. You can watch the playback on the World Affairs Council's Pittsburgh YouTube channel, but we're going to continue and finish off with our presentation on how you can get involved using digital advocacy. We would like to turn it over to Luke, and then Maya will close it out for the afternoon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Luke. You may know me from some of the past seminars that we've done here. So as you may know, at the end of every seminar, we're doing a short little segment on using your digital voice, because it's really important to learn about the way that COVID-19 impacts politics and vice versa, but it's also really important to advocate on behalf of issues that you care about. So as a part of the Council's Building Back Better campaign, we are partnering with iGeneration Youth for these short segments at the end on using your digital voice. And if you find this topic interesting and you find using your digital voice a really interesting topic that you want to learn more about, at the end of this 5-part seminar series, iGeneration Youth will be hosting another seminar solely about using your digital voice. And the registration for that will be at the end of this little segment. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so as I said earlier, this will be a segment on using your digital voice. Today we are focusing on Twitter. Last week we were talking mostly about Instagram, and so Twitter is a really effective social media platform. It has an estimated 1 billion unique visitors every month. And it's a really great way to build relationships over time and also to keep up to date with, to stay up to date with real-time news and to have real-time conversations with people about issues. And so it's a really great way to connect with influencers and decision makers, which is a really important aspect of advocacy work. So one of the first things you want to think about when using Twitter for advocacy is making goals that are specific and measurable to the advocacy that you're doing. So this will help you later on when you're trying to measure the impact that you are having and adjust your strategy to have the biggest impact in the future. So one aspect of that is, who is your audience? Are you trying to reach journalists or policymakers or community leaders? Are you trying to attract new members to your organization? And once you've identified that audience, you can use that information to create content that specifically targets your audience so that you can advocate more effectively. So also when you are using Twitter, you want to think, and also kind of using any social media platform, you want to think about the purpose of every tweet and what you're trying to achieve. So this requires you to consider the needs of your audience. So you want to think, is there something that my audience specifically needs and specifically wants from me? So that could be an educational resource, or that could be information about a specific event that they could attend. And so you want to really have a clear focus of what the purpose of your tweet is, and you want that purpose to kind of be a balance between being informative and then also engaging in conversation, because Twitter is a really great place to spread information, but it's also a place where people have conversations about topics. And so you want to make sure that your advocacy strategy combines the two. You also want to be able to build your credibility and also to increase your exposure by using hashtags and connecting your tweets to breaking news and things that are currently happening that people are talking about. This will allow people to see your tweets. This will allow people to see your tweets who don't already follow you and help you grow a larger audience as well. And like with every social media platform, you don't want it to be just a one-way conversation. You don't want to just be tweeting out into the void and not getting any engagement. And so you want to make sure that you're engaging with people in meaningful ways, as well as pushing out the content that you're trying to promote. So that means that you might want to comment and like and retweet other people's content and content from your followers or other people that you find on Twitter searches. And so this will help build your audience and put your name out even further, which will help more people see your content. And so I'm going to quickly turn it over to Akshay from iGeneration Youth to talk about this specific example of a media campaign.
Hi, everyone. My name is Akshay. So excited to be here with you today. So I'm one of the Pittsburgh Bureau Chiefs of iGeneration Youth. And so today we're just going to be briefly discussing this tweet that you see on the screen here on the little smartphone. So for a recent piece we published this month that I wrote about the COVID-19 vaccine candidate from UPMC, the one that Dr. Dupre discussed on one of the World Affairs webinars, my editor and I did a full social media promotion. So first, we can see from a composition point of view at this tweet, it's written in a way that kind of drops viewers straight into the story, with the aim of leaving them kind of intrigued and wanting to know more about kind of what that article has to say. So this obviously has application in writing or published work, but it can also be used in dozens of other contexts. So say, for example, you have an event you're trying to promote. Think of maybe trying to come up with a short story in your mind about what that event will be, how it started, what would make it interesting to people who you might want to join. And write your tweet in a way that kind of drops your viewers directly into that scene. Because the more interest you create in their mind, the more likely they are to engage with that tweet and with you. So the same also can be seen for the image. So you can kind of see that in the last slide, that image right below that says COVID-19 vaccine has a lot of information, but it's also still visually striking. So that also supports the text effort. So try to do the same for your tweets. But most importantly, really just kind of try to get creative and make images that you think really align with your message and what you're trying to convey to people. So this particular tweet from iGeneration was retweeted, shared, and promoted by the UNICEF Measles and Rubella Initiative, the World Health which is also run by the World Health Organization, Vaccines Today, UPMC, the University of Pittsburgh Health Sciences, the Center for Vaccine Research, and the British Society of Microbiology, just to name a few, including a bunch more of leading microbiologists. So between these groups, it was shared by over 101,000 Twitter followers and received close to 10,000 Twitter impressions. So what really allowed for the success was, I think, the above things, with really kind of dropping viewers into the scene, getting them excited about the piece, but also reaching out to potential supporters and sponsors in these organizations and asking for their support, which I think is really important, because the worst they'll say is no. So you have all the world to gain in reaching out and saying, hey, we have this project we're working on. We would love it if you could retweet with a comment or anything like that. And really the sky's the limit there. So yeah, a little bit about this tweet and this sort of the social media response it gained.
Thank you so much. All right. So when you are making a post, you want to also consider, what do you want people to do with your post? What kind of response do you want? Do you want people to retweet? Do you want people to sign a petition or register for an upcoming workshop? And so the better that you communicate what your ask is, the easier it will be for people who see your tweet to act on it and to get on board with your campaign. And so this is also part of your strategy that we talked about earlier on in the segment. This is all part of that strategy of who are you targeting and what do you want them to do. And so this is a little bit more about what Akshay was just talking about. When you are creating a social media plan, this is like a brief document that you can use to identify who you're reaching out to. What do you want them to say when they interact with your content? What accounts do they have? What hashtags do they have? All of these things are really important things to consider when reaching out to people, and it will help them engage more quickly with your tweet, and it will help spread the message to a larger audience. And it's also really important not just to tag organizations, but to really reach out to them via email and create like a personal connection with them, instead of just tagging them and hoping that they repost. You'll be a lot more successful if you actually reach out to them off of Twitter. Additionally, we talked about this last week in the Instagram seminar, but it's also important to measure the impact that your tweets are having. So look at the analytics and insights. This will be really helpful for determining what's working and what's not working. And again, you can refer back to your strategy and your goals that you've set at the beginning to see, are you hitting those goals? And if not, what do you need to do to hit those goals? So that's all for this segment. If you want to learn more about using your digital voice, again, you should join us on August 5th for a workshop led by iGeneration Youth. The link to register is right on the screen. It's also the same link you use to register for this event as well. And then additionally, iGeneration Youth has graciously opened up their office hours to any student that was a part of this seminar. So this is a really great way to workshop stories, get advice from experts, and it's also a free resource to use. So it's a really great way to get started. That is all for me. I guess I'll turn it over to Maya to close out.
Thanks, Luke and Akshay. Sorry that this went a couple minutes over, so I'm just going to close out really quickly. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Next week will be the COVID-19 X Economy Seminar, so we hope to see you all there.